And without further ado, let me give the mic, if you have a mic, to Anne-Sophie Lechevallier and her panel. Thank you very much.
Alors, bonjour. Good morning, everyone. We've already discussed this, but the attempts to set up a taxation on billionaires have emerged. Brazil talked about it on the international stage and made it a topic at the roundtable of the G20, and also put it on its international agenda. It is now part of the public debate in France and other European countries. The French National Assembly, after discussing it widely, voted a bill from the Green Party setting up a minimum taxation on the ultra-high net worth individuals. On top of the socialist suggestion to implement a tax for the billionaires that would yield €2 billion. To talk about this, we have two MPs who sit at the Finance Committee, but do not have the same position. David Amiel is a French politician. He was an advisor to the French President of the Republic. He represents the current Ensemble member party, and and Éric Coquerel is part of the LFI radical left movement, and he's also part of the Finance Committee. So these are our two panelists, and we will confront both their viewpoints when it comes to taxing the high-income earners. And we will see whether legislators' action is necessary. So maybe let's start with this. With you, Éric Coquerel, is it necessary to amend the law to set up a taxation for the high-income earners and set up a progressive tax? Yes, amending the law or discussing a budget along those lines. Let me remind you that the so-said Zuckman tax or levy that we voted on at the National Assembly, and that was discussed by the National Assembly earlier on. The far right and the center party had made some suggestion. So why do we need to amend the law, in my opinion? Very briefly, the deficit is increasing. The number one priority from the different Macron administrations were to reduce the deficit. So it's a total failure. And the deficit doesn't come from an increase in public expenditure because it remains stable compared to the GDP since 2017. But there's a clear reduction in income for the benefit of the wealthiest. And by wealthiest, I mean the one who holds capitals with certain generous tax cuts that have made it more beneficial to them. So we are now in a situation where capital is too expensive. We no longer have the means to offer tax cuts to the wealthiest. And if we want to have more room for maneuver, and invest in the green transition on par with Piffer-Masu's reports. Last year, we reduced by 1.5 billion the budget allocated to the environment compared to the tens of billions that we will need by 2030. So we no longer have the financial means to do so. So we need to find some room for maneuver, hence this bill. And let me also remind you that when we voted the income part, we had looked for 60 billion euro additional income, which might raise some constitutional issues, but 2/3 remain now by reinstating the wealth tax, for example, and other taxes on assets could help find back those billions missing. And I do think that this issue will become of the utmost importance, considering the context, the current context, with tariffs being raised. If the only instrument that we have to reduce deficit is not taxes, then we will not help the most humble segments of the population. So, of course, we need to go find funds in the pockets of those who may have more money than they need right now. What about you, David? Should we increase taxation, although this is a debate in your own political party? So I would say yes, but I don't agree with Éric Coquerel. I think we have different proposals on the table. There is an issue in France, but not only, in all global economies. There is an issue of tax avoidance from multi-billionaires. We have an issue with multinational enterprises. And this is an issue for tax consent purposes. If we go back to the 1990s or beginning of the year 2000s, trade was making winners and losers. Netto, it would increase wealth, so there were more winners than losers, but we should redistribute from the winners to the losers in a direct or indirect way using taxes and other means. But the obstacle was the following. At the same time, the financial globalization led to a race to the bottom. So a reduction to our ability to tax multinational enterprises and the wealthiest individuals. So if we want to save the trade system, internationally speaking, we need to take back control over taxation, internationally speaking. Gabrielle's work sitting here have been extremely enlightening on those issues. And both are intrinsically linked. 2 years ago, yes, in 2023, time flies by, but the work I did on policies showed that in the very last percentile in the distribution of taxes, there is a tax degressivity. There is taxes on corporations coming from a foreign country, and there are taxes on the poorest as well. So if we want to address taxation for the high-income earners, we need to work on all taxation areas. But I do not agree with Éric Coquerel on one thing. If we are to solve this issue, and if we are to set up a taxation issue, it's because it's a justice matter rather than being a public policy issue. So if I were to be a bit mean with Éric Coquerel, whose party voted along with the far right to get a constitutional majority. But I think that this bill goes further than the ultra-high net worth individuals. If we want to invest in the green transition and in defense and reduce public deficit to reach a level that would stabilize it at the level of the GDP, we would need 140 billion euros. When we look at the taxation on the high income or top income earners, a study conducted by Terra Nova a year ago stated that we could get 15 billion out of 40 billion. Okay, let's be more ambitious. Let's maybe find 25 billion. But the essential message is that it only covers a minority of the budgetary adjustment we need to make. So we shouldn't be wrong in how we deal with this, because this is an issue that goes beyond taxation. This is an employment issue, a budgetary issue, etc., etc. But taxing the wealthiest will not be enough to reduce our deficit. And lastly, does it help us fight against the far-right movement, which is one of our concerns right now? I do not think so. I do think that issues of growth, of salary increase. We had a debate with Jérôme Gate here a few months back. And territorial divides are as much important. So you do not have the same hierarchy of the different goals, but you do agree on the need to have a legislation along those lines. So what are your proposals? Let's maybe start with the different options that are already on the table. Éric Coquerel, you voted in favor of the proposal by the Green Party on a taxation inspired by Gabriel Zucman's work. So is that the right instrument? Do you think it should be added to other proposals during the next finance framework for France? And do you think what the government is working on is the right one, this anti-optimizing instrument? I do not dispute Terra Nova's work, but finding only 15 or 25 billion, in my opinion, is not right. The share of the wealthiest assets in France went from 25 to 42% since 2017. So this is a considerable increase. It almost doubled, whereas the national wealth hasn't doubled. If the national wealth doesn't double and only like 500 people see their wealth double, it is done at the expense of the rest of the population and because of huge tax cuts. And the only tax on wealth itself, depending on the thresholds, could bring in 13 to 15 billion euros. And there are other ways to compensate, bringing the wealth tax back, getting rid of the flat tax, making the income tax fairer with more tax tranches. But as contrary to what David said, I think we can go look for up to 60 billions. So I think this is what should be possible. Gabriel, who's here with us, suggested a tax, and there is another one. There's one on multinational enterprises. It points at the issues that we are trying to address or have been trying to address since 2017. David quoted a study, and the IPP also conducted a study 2 years ago, and it showed that by providing unprecedented tax cuts to capital income compared to conventional income, we went from the 174 wealthiest, I think that's the appropriate number. Taxation is at about 25%, or used to be, and I think there was an article published in Libération newspaper, whereas people who are subject to income tax are taxed by 50%. So it meant that the government was losing money. So this gives you an idea of the margin. But no matter the situation, we need to make sure that the wealthiest pay 2% at least of taxes with this Gabriel Zucman tax. So I think this is a great tax that will bring in a lot of funds. It can be done unilaterally. And we don't need to wait for all European member states' decision. So I think this is the right measure to apply. And this gives me an opportunity to talk to you about a second tax, the one on multinational enterprises. It is this tax emerged because of profits that are made abroad. So some companies can do their tax returns in countries where the tax level is for their benefit. So in my opinion, this is a smart taxation policy because it will try to make tax returns fairer, because the wealthiest companies, which are much larger than SMEs, for example, and concentrated in certain countries, will now pay their fair share. And I think these two taxes will help get more than the amounts mentioned by David. So do you share some of what has been said by Mr. Coquerel? Oh, one more thing. And I think this is needed to reduce inequalities. But the issue of the lack of government income is at stake here. And I think this is due to Macron's policies. So I would like to tell you my viewpoint. Beyond the figures mentioned by David Coquerel, the reform of the wealth tax is not on the table because it will be 3 or 4 billion euros without any induced economic effect. Éric will say the opposite, but when we try to find an economic equilibrium, this is only what should be brought in. If we say we will bring in 15 billion, we still have 80% to find. Éric in the fall talked about 57 billion of additional contributions needed. Historically, we pay 3 times more taxes than in 1980. So we cannot say that we are not taxing. But even in this case, most of our financial issues will remain. So we need to keep those macroeconomic points in mind. Then when it comes to the solutions to find to meet this financial gap, I think there's an issue with taxation for multi-billionaires. And I would like to thank the EU Tax Observatory for their work because they taught me a great deal. There is the issue of the holdings, and they can bypass certain taxation by personally holding a holding company. And in my opinion, the holdings were there to make taxation easier for European groups, but then it was used to bypass taxes. So, of course, we need to solve this issue. There is the wrong way to do it, to put back the wealth tax on the table, because it was shown that it did not solve this issue. But we can think of a tax incentive at the French level while waiting to reach parent subsidy regime at the European level. I had made a proposal before the agreements with the Socialist Party at the time of Michel Barnier. I suggested that we created a tax safety net, if you will, to make sure that there would be a minimum contribution. The figure mentioned is 0.5%. We can debate this, but the goal was to make sure that the personal income would at least account for 0.5 of the wealth, but then we'll have a longer debate on it if you want, to make sure that financial holdings that are used as a savings instrument for multi-billionaire as a personal bank account, and you only get cash for your daily expenses, but it is not subject to taxes. Whereas when you get your wage, you put some on your savings account or your life insurance product, and you will be subject to taxes. So this is a problem that we need to solve. And how can you solve this? Yes, we need to solve this issue. I'm a little embarrassed because there is a debate that I would have loved to listen to. This is the previous panel. The goal is to use legal definition, economic revenue, or the wealth. So have a base to make sure that we deal with all wealth. So do we need a specific tax on holdings? To my knowledge, this is what is going on in the United States. This might be a solution. But in France, we need to move forward along those lines while waiting for parent subsidiary regime reform at the European level. And there's another issue, the race to the bottom. It is obvious that for multinational enterprises, but we also notice it for natural persons, taxation rates are lower and lower. A debate occurred during the G20 in Brazil, and France supported this work. Now, ever since Donald Trump was invested, we need to debate this even more because the G20 might be paralyzed in the next few years because of the United States. And you do not need to be a geopolitician to guess that it might not be their priority in the United States right now. Can we move on without the United States? Yes, I think we can, but I think we need to move forward more at the European level. And so without waiting too long, as Coquerel said. So do you think this is something that could be done swiftly? I think that the past few years are now showing that we can move forward at the European level. Some people say, okay, if we do things at the European level, it means that we will not do anything. But if we look at the carbon tax instrument at the border, at the European borders, or if we look at the European viewpoint on Ukraine now, we can see that Europe is reacting much faster than it used to. And there are a lot of skeptical people who say that Europe is slipping away, but I do not think so. I think that now we're seeing some victories in Europe, and I think we have reasons to be hopeful. And when it comes to your work under the Barnier government, and when it comes to the different taxation on the high-income earners, could you explain how all of this work? What are your goals, and what are the differences between the different tax instruments? So there was a bill voted in the fall, and it doesn't include the main instrument to bypass profits from holdings, for example. So in many cases, this is related to the presumptive tax rate, and some people pay less or fewer taxes than they're supposed to. So this was an instrument that was a bit different, but I do not think it targets the main issue. The main issue at stake is not how tax credits are used. The issue is using holdings to bypass the different tax regimes. So if we can have a more long-term instrument, this will be more useful. So you've both mentioned different obstacles, different hurdles. So how do you think we can overcome those obstacles? There is the issue of professional goods. There are other arguments put forward. the risk of tax exile. Can France move forward alone if the G20 is not moving along those lines? So what is your opinion on all of this? So before going into the techniques of this debate, let's take stock of the situation. I've heard what my esteemed colleague has said, but we should take stock of the current policy that has been led since 2017. So increasing mandatory contribution is much higher than in the 1980s. But since 2017, the income has gone down by 3 points. 3 points. And we can look at it either way you wish. It is beneficial to the wealthiest and even the ultra-high net worth individuals. And I'm not even talking about injustice here. I'm talking about liquid assets that are not part of the government's coffers right now. And then there is the competitiveness and supply policy. It was accelerated since it's been accelerated since 2017, and the goal was to use capitals in the country to create more jobs. But there is no figure showing that it has worked. And employment should reach 8% by the end of the year. Reindustrialization is not a reality. The share of industrial jobs in the total of employment has reduced since 2017, and we are now noticing that manufacturing production will also lower. Poverty keeps increasing, and we have noticed that wages themselves in terms of purchasing power have reduced, which what made it possible to maintain the purchasing power was the wealth tax. So the competitiveness and the supply policies have not worked. They have failed. And it will be even worse with Trump's administration now. So we need to tax the ultra-high net worth individuals, because if we have a system that keeps throwing money out the window, what I mean by that is that the bet was for tax cuts made to be reinvested in the economy, but it was reinvested in dividends. We have multiplied the dividends of the CAC 40 by 2 since 2017, and those dividends haven't been reinvested. So if we continue moving forward along those lines, this money remains in the hands of a minority. And this is not very much acceptable in a country, a Republican country such as us, that fights against inequalities. And we've seen it with the Yellow Vest movement, for instance. If we continue as such, the deficit will continue to rise. If the deficit had gone down, we could have said that one of the goals stated by Emmanuel Macron would have succeeded. But as I said earlier, and this is not a small detail, you mentioned investment in the green transition. Yes, we agree on this. We are very far from meeting our goals. Minus 1.5 billion last year in terms of environmental policy. Well, Bafus, Pisani-Ferrini estimate that we would need an additional 37 billion. And others say we need an additional 50 billion by 2030. So this is an overall failure. So this is not working. We need to stop.
So the way in which we need to stop, of course, after that, we can give ourselves all the reasons saying this is not possible. We can't do this because competitiveness, we're going to wait for the EU. I think that you're very optimistic to explain to me how for the past several years it is given proofs of its capacity to act on the taxation aspect. Pillar 1 is not moving very fast. Pillar 2 is going to be called into question by Trump in the upcoming weeks. I'm saying that if we don't take any drastic measures that reverse these policies, whereas the various statistics that were released show that French companies are suffering from demand, not supply or cost of labor, but demand, we are going to end up here with figures that will be even worse in a year's time. So we're going to let David Amiel answer on these points. Well, thank you, Éric Coquerel, because I agree with the last sentence. Yes, indeed, the French economy is suffering less from supply issues than 8 years ago. It is the measures that we've set up have unlocked this constraint. You were saying there have been some fiscal gifts. So the essential of the tax decreases were the poll tax. It is not the tax that bothers the billionaires. It's more the tax that impacted the working class, and it was where it struck the most. In Paris, we didn't pay a lot of it, and the decrease of corporate tax, the decrease of corporate tax, and the decrease of production taxes, because a decrease of social contributions was done under François Hollande. It was enshrined during the first mandate of Emmanuel Macron. I think that this policy has helped, and France does not have a problem of cost of labor. It's less of a problem than before, because when we compare it with the Germans, we have amended this discrepancy. You're saying that there's no figure that shows that it worked. Well, the rate of unemployment has decreased by 30% since 2017. You're saying we have a demand issue that is going to make unemployment rise. It's true that this year we're going to undergo crisis that is going to have an impact on the rate of employment. It's linked to Donald Trump that has created a recessive shock throughout the world. But if we look over several years, when you look at the effects of a policy, you can see a massive decrease in the rate of unemployment. You're saying that this policy was done to attract investments. It's true, and it worked from that perspective, because we can see that we're the most attractive country in Europe for foreign investments. And you spoke about industrial employment, and the number of industrial jobs has stopped to collapse, which had been the case during the 90s and the 2000s. So I've sort of lost the thread on Europe. On Europe, I think that as for economic issues, we have indeed a vision that is very different with Éric, beyond the tax or technical engineering of it. I belong to a family of thought that considers that capitalism, in order to be regulated, needs the EU, and it's on that scale that we can play our strength in globalization. So he's saying that it's possible nationally. We were talking about 1981. It's not a new debate in French political life, but we have deep differences between the two of us. Éric Coquerel? Well, first of all, on the figures put forward, no, the manufacturing industry is decreasing. I'm going to give you the figures by 3%. And industrial jobs went from 16.4 to 15 something. The figures that I'm giving you are not taking into account the layoff plans, because productivity is decreasing, and we had a rate of maintaining job that was underestimated. Of course, you don't take into account the layoff plans. And in the jobs that you are proud of, you have almost 900,000 apprentices. So you've multiplied them by 3. And these are not really the jobs that you continue to put forward when we talk about creation of job. And as to the foreign investment, I can hear it. Yes. I'm used, since Bruno Le Maire, to see a super success in terms of industrialization. We would be the country in which foreign investments are the largest in terms of number, yes, but in terms of creation of jobs and volume, no, we're barely in the EU average. So we're presented an idyllic table of the effects of these policies that don't hold the ground. So on Europe, I'm answering very quickly. Yes, I come from a family that feels that we shouldn't wait upon decisions on goodness knows what horizon, whenever European decisions are done unanimously on taxation issues. And at some point, France can do things alone. France is a big country that can open some aspects in terms of reinforced cooperation with a number of European countries that could follow on taxation issues. And I can see that somewhere when you attack the rights of unemployed people, you're doing it unilaterally and not looking at Europe. So in France, there are things that we can do as well vis-a-vis those who have really enjoyed your policy since 2017, because we needed their money to go quickly without waiting for things to start moving on the European level. So you have arguments that are often opposed in public debate. So you have taxation. Do you consider that it's a tax exile? You can't create a situation that wouldn't require a tax exile, because the ultra rich would not pay taxes, because the money that we lose with the tax exile, the figures were given and the studies were done when we suppressed the wealth tax and reestablished tax on the share of the people leaving or coming back is really very marginal. We know the money that we're losing by making taxation gifts to advantage the ultra rich people. So fiscal taxation exile, is it an argument in your political family to say that you need to act because this risk is real? Well, I have no doubt it's before tax exile with an increase of 60 billion euros of taxation. You trigger a mechanism that is tax exile, but it's also the capital evasion. I think that they're a very important debate, and it's important to be coherent. And Éric, you're not favorable to it unless it was the case to the Treaty of Maastricht. Yes, I was not favorable. Yeah, I thought you wouldn't be. If we go to the end of this rationale, of course, you've got major capital leaving. The only way to do it is to control the capital nationally and exit the Eurozone. And there's a rationale behind that. It can be good or not, but a program of this nature would lead to an economic collapse within the current European framework. And if we can have not the wild globalizations or this form of albanization of the French economy, we need to move forward on this. So what is central on this tax issue is a taxation of professional assets. So can you explain to us our perspective and how you make sure that it's not going to impact the yield and the profitability? Well, that's why I started by saying that I was jumping into this debate with more the concern of justice and fairness rather than that of budgetary yield, because I think that the reestablishment of public finances won't go through this unless we have a taxation shock that goes beyond this, and it would lead to an economic collapse that would create abysmal inequalities. But to answer the question of professional assets, I consider that professional assets, and this is where I have a nuance with the note that was said here, they are not an economic revenue. It's a proposal that is being made in this discussion, and I believe that we need to treat it in a very different way from a holding which is created for financial means and tax evasion means, and everybody can realize this. It's obvious that a holding is used to park revenue from corporations, is more a vehicle for saving than a company that has a valuation that can evolve for all sorts of reasons. Next, what would happen if we decided to impose taxation on professional assets? Well, there's a problem of liquidity in many cases. You've got fluctuation of the valuation that can be very important without the company having revenue. Let's take the example that we often take of Mistral AI, but you can take any other big tech company. They've got a significant valuation because there's a promise of future revenue, but sometimes they have zero revenue or they incur losses and they reinvest a lot. If we wanted to tax them proportionally to their valuation, we would constrain these companies to release cash to pay taxes that they don't have and that they don't generate today. And it would lead these companies to have to sell shares to other investors, foreign investors. And I think that all of this would not be very logical. Second thing that seems weird to me is that it's a taxation that leads the companies to pay more dividends, to pay taxes. We need to encourage companies to retain their dividends, to invest. And last time we spoke about the parent subsidiary directive, it was to do the reverse because it was the reform from François Hollande, which was to modulate the taxes paid by corporations. So the infamous 3% on dividends, saying the company will pay less taxes if they reinvest their profit, and they will pay more if they release it as dividend. So here we encourage them to, we allow them to release more money to pay more taxes, and it's contradictory with a long-term investment. Then a third argument that seems quite significant to me, we create a taxation difference between the companies held by physical persons and those that are not. A company held by a physical person should pay more taxes because they should be considered as part of an economic revenue, rather than a company that is held by pension funds that would pay less taxes. And here I hear a lot about the fact that we shouldn't go toward a great financiarization of the economy. This would lead us to do it, and it would profoundly change the governance of French companies by giving the way open for French pension funds and foreign pension funds. And it's not happened since if this question of the professional assets was pushed to the side when the wealth tax was created in 1981, because the debate dates back from there. So I'm not going to come back to that, but it was starting in 1982. We had a decision to not tax the professional assets, and we also got rid of the wealth tax in 1988. So it would be a very bad idea to include professional assets, and it doesn't answer the issue of the justice that we're looking for. Éric Coquerel? Well, a small comment. If we increase the mandatory taxation of the ultra-rich, they're going to go into exile. There's a very interesting study for the Committee of the Mandatory Taxation from October 2024, which shows that when you go up in the revenue earned by the people, so 200 times the average revenue, in reality, France is not the leader of European countries in terms of mandatory taxes. We're in the average. We are behind Germany, the UK, Belgium, Denmark, because making a taxation gift to these people, we're no longer in a situation where we pay more, and they would have a tendency to go and look for light as well and less taxes elsewhere. So that's the first comment. You need to look concretely at what exists rather than having ourselves a discourse that makes theirs legitimate, which is to always decrease taxation. There's never any end. You need to find a country that no longer taxes us, and they would say, well, why are you still taxing us in France? Because we can go elsewhere, and they won't do. And the limit is to take decisions and constraining measures with regards to people like Bernard Arnault are threatening when a big share of their wealth is done on products made in France. It is something that is linked to French quality, and they're threatening to leave if we were taking a little bit of money more. And for me, I cannot hear this. And just thinking that they would be legitimate to say so really disturbs me a lot from this perspective. Secondly, if we don't tax professional assets. Let's not do it, because the specificity of this tax difference that we've had since 2017 is to make sure that we can transfer assets and personal revenue to professional assets and professional revenue that shelter money that is going to be used by them or by their children. And here it touches upon the issue of wealth always derived from inheritance rather than the work we can do during our lives. So if we don't tax professional assets, it's pointless, because including them touches upon what was done since 2017. That's my answer. And I understand that you're always going to put together reasons why we do it, but we should be honest with ourselves. We should not look for the tax revenue that we need from that side. We might take homeopathical measures because it's so obvious in the situation in which we are, and with the money that we're missing, that it's unbearable to have an accumulation of wealth for a few dozens of people. Again, it's unheard of in the history of this country since the ancient regime, and that we should accept these homeopathical measures. And no, we need to come back to this, and I'm radically in disagreement from that perspective. We need to include professional assets in the various taxes on the ultra wealthy. So we saw your disagreement on the scope, the amplitude, and the modality, but there's an agreement on the necessity to act. And maybe we can wrap up with an obstacle that you've mentioned but not explored. Is there a political consensus in a National Assembly that is very fragmented as of last year? So can you talk about this? How do you see the evolution of the debates, and how do you see the evolution and the opposition of the ones and the others? So what do you think about this topic that can be consensual and well established? Are you seeing the same across the political spectrum? Well, consensus, obviously not. The debate that we've had for almost an hour, well, beyond a very general principle, we can see that there are two economic visions between Éric and myself that are very different. I don't think it's a surprise for anybody. And what is interesting here, I'm struck in this debate by the fact that in the discourse that is being said amongst La France Insoumise, there's no arbitration. So the more a measure has yield, the better it is. So it's quite a simple criteria. So we're told, yeah, of course you need to take all of the professional assets, and you can take half, and there'll be a lot of yield, and it'll be better. So there's a difficulty of the economic policy, is that we need to find a balance between the necessity of budgetary yield, the correction of inequalities, and the need to safeguard the investment and economic growth that also serve justice, employment, and economic growth, because I'm part of a regulated market economy, which is not exactly the framework of thought for Éric Coquerel. And I absolutely respect this difference, but it's such a deep difference that it's very hard to find a consensus between the two of us. Also, in the Assembly, there can be some progress on these issues. There will be discussions. We know what the framework of discussion for the next budget is a discussion between the central bloc, the Republicans, and the Socialist Party. This is the frame of negotiation for the next budget, because Éric will vote a censorship motion against this government. The National Rally will probably do the same. So what is going to be the discussions with the Socialist Party and the Conservatives, LR, to have a something on the differential contribution of the high revenues that was in the last law of finance. So we saw quite a large majority around the green. So after the Senate and going back to the Assembly, do you see a possible way forward? Well, first of all, I need to say the caricature done of La France Insoumise is something I want to react to because, of course, the proposal, I'll make you notice something when Jean-Paul Mathily of the Modem is making proposals on taxing dividends that are not the threshold that we imagine. We vote for them because we understand if the consensus or majority must stand out to tax dividends under a certain cap below what we feel is necessary, but we're going to try to be well-meaning and open the door. We do it, and that's all we've done in the budgetary decisions. And to come back to the caricature that they draw of us and we saying that we can't be a majority, and the only majority is around the central bloc, taking or no the Socialist Party. I believe that there's a possible majority on a program and measures that are considerably changing the game. And once again, the proof is that there's a majority for the Ukraine tax at the National Assembly. It is the proof is in the pudding. There is one. There has been one on most of the measures that I mentioned, with sometimes thresholds that were a little bit lower, durations that were lower with regards to what we recommended, but they weren't the right way, and we voted for them. And today in the Assembly, there's more a majority to apply this program, but rather than the program of supply and competitivity, the proof is that you like 49.3. That's a consideration. There were elections last July. If you didn't see the governmental translation of it, that raises another issue. But the programs and especially the positions that could have gone for more social and taxation justice in this country on retirement reforms is a majority in the country, and the Assembly is the translation of this. Sometimes it's a weird translation because there's not the forces that vote, and there's some things that are majority in this country. And the question of reducing the inequalities and looking for revenue that are much more on the side of the scale and very reduced on the other side of the scale is a majority in the country, and we should leap from there. To answer your question, there cannot be a consensus. Of course, that would be surprising, but we can have some broad majorities if we wanted to suppress the Article 49.3. We've got a budget that is very transformed at the end of the day, the National Assembly. Thank you both. Just to remind what the Parliament does. If I was teasing Éric Coquerel, we spend a lot of time together, actually. We would need a 49.3 to have a majority than the National Rally, because in reality, the majority that you're shaping, and I don't think you wish for it, but this majority is a majority with the National Rally. So I'll do the list of the laws that you vote just with the National Rally. Well, that's a next debate. So we're going to give the floor to the room for your questions, if you have any. Hello, Luca. I'm an activist with the Association to Tax Financial Transaction, member of ATTAC. I wanted to ask a question for Mr. Amiel. I was very happy to see that you're going to set up taxation justice. I saw in your last program that you said you didn't want to increase taxes for the French. So do you consider the billionaires as non-French? So if you change your opinion, how can you change the opinion of the other people who are not there? And do you find that a rate of 2% is fair? Because I pay more than 2%, whereas I make less than the average wage. On both questions, first of all, on the first one, I believe indeed that the issue for the billionaires that we talk about is not so much the question of the taxes that they're paying, but of the taxes that they do not pay. Because what we see in the memo from Gabriel's work with the IPP is more a problem of tax evasion rather than the nominal rate of the taxation. So to go back to what you were saying, I'm very comfortable with saying that we have an issue that is not increasing taxes, but making sure that the taxes that are supposed to be paid are paid by everybody. Next, concerning the rate of taxes, 2%, 5%, we can see that the idea of an economic revenue, which in reality is the assets, because it is the base that is underneath that cannot be compared to a wage. That's why we don't have a rate of 45%, which would be the superior marginal rate for the imposition. So the rate that is being discussed is in that ballpark. Internationally, I think that 2 is a good reference. It's the framework of the works. So I won't come back to professional assets, but for France, we need to target a lower rate and with a discussion around 0.5. So I'm waiting for the parameters of other figures, looking at what is being carried out for the next finance project. Hello, Grégoire Rondoyer for AFP. So I have a question. Thank you for this debate. I have a question for David Amiel. We have seen that the major majority of the revenue of a multimillionaire came from their professional assets, and it was impossible to tax billionaires without taxing this. So my question would be, what do you suggest? So are you in favor or against the regressivity of taxes for the wealthiest? And if not, what do you suggest to remedy this regressive aspect, whereas the state of science says that it would not be possible without impacting professional assets? Well, we're not going to redo this past hour's debate. I consider that professional assets are not as such an economic revenue, and that is the debate to define this. It's a principal debate that we have today. I consider that there are forms of revenue that are not being taxed. I think that's why we need to tackle this on the European level. We're not going to come back to the discussion that we've had, but it is in this way that we can answer this tax question on multi-billionaire. But I don't consider that in the case of Mistral, for instance, because the valuation has increased a lot for the past 3 years. I don't know when it was created. We can say that the economic revenue of the person who has it, the company has had zero revenue. It would have exploded considerably. So it is fictitious to impose this, and it would lead to the reverse of what we want for the economy. It would reduce the short term, reducing this by releasing cash and paying dividends, and it would increase the ownership of French companies by foreign pension funds, and that would create a big discrepancy between these two types of owners. No, I believe that it's valid when, even if we have this disagreement on these professional assets. I have not seen the simulations of the past 2 days. I dispute the consideration of considering professional assets as a economic revenue.
Suprio Day from the International Monetary Fund. Just listening into this wonderful debate. Thank you so much for sparing your time and informing us of this. I found something very interesting that you both of you maybe touched upon, is the idea that irrespective of whether you call it G20 or otherwise, maybe you could form a coalition of the willing to move forward with tax reforms, irrespective of whether some other large economy joins up or not. And with, I think, France and Brazil taking steps, do you think how long do you think it takes, and how much do you think there is a possibility of that? B, regarding the migration of ultra high net worth individuals, billionaires, whatever you call them, in response to taxes. We do understand that some of them go to small open economies, sometimes called tax havens. So if you have a coalition of the willing like that, how do you think you could tackle the tax havens which sort of very explicitly try to attract for tax residency purposes such high net worth individuals? Thank you.
Alors, merci pour la question. Déjà,
Thank you for asking this question. There's a first issue that should be raised. There are tax havens that are not even part of the list of tax havens, and they're located right in Europe. And they're right at the core of this issue. For example, on multinational enterprises, taxation of their profits being transferred elsewhere, in Ireland or elsewhere. So there's a certain number of countries involved, and that is the whole issue at stake in Europe. The debate with David was the following. We're not saying that Europe cannot be the single lever. I'm sure it can be, but I think we shouldn't wait for Europe to make a decision. We need to have a political, economic space which makes total free trade possible, but there is no tax standardization. So that is my way to shed light on your question. And as long as we don't solve this issue, and unfortunately might not be solved swiftly, because there's an incentive for countries to have a low taxation rates. So we might need regulation. Even at the international level, we have pillar number 2. Pillar number 2 might be limited in a few weeks from now, in reality, because the US will no longer be invested. Pillar 2 could have partly solved this issue. And I think Pillar 1 didn't even, or was born not to be efficient, in my opinion. But I think we should take some decisions at the national level already. And this brings me to your other question. I am deeply convinced that if France were to do it, it would find international partners willing to move along those lines. I'm saying that France is leading the way. When I say this, I mean that we should use setting an example as a strategy, because I think we heard more than we think. France is not a dwarf country, and decisions made in France have no importance. Maybe not all European countries might be interested, but there could be a solution, cooperatives in Europe, or with other countries in Latin America, for example. So we need to look at what we can do, trigger it, and then find partner countries. If it's the whole of the EU, I would be delighted. But of course, there are limitations, in my opinion, and I do not want to wait for a European coalition. That's my point. But I do think that part of our discussion will be accelerated because of what Trump is doing. When we look at the reaction regarding the increase in tariffs, there are 2 types of reaction. One says we will negotiate with Trump. In other words, we will accept to buy more American products, weapons and others, so that we can lower this increase in tariffs. Or the second reaction is the reciprocity of the increase in tariffs. I think that both are mistakes. Reciprocity is not the solution, because our own national consumption will suffer before the one in the US. I think that the FCE is publishing figures along those lines. And it states that if we do not move, or if we still have the tariffs, the growth will lower by 0.5 in a few years' time. But if we do something about it, the decrease will be similar. So over the long run, I think that we should tax the GAFAM, so the tech giants, US tech giants. By taxing them, we will have some room for maneuver, and this will have a direct impact on the US without affecting our national consumption. So taxing multinational enterprises will accelerate the debate, in my opinion. And to briefly shed some light on your questions, I do not think in moral leadership. That is not an argument to put forward. I think that the world reacts better to balance of power. So I think that we should speak this lingua franca. What you said on Trump, I do share some arguments with you. A month and a half ago, I wrote down a working document to detail what Trump was about to do. I said that Trump would wage a tariffs war. And I said that we should take him seriously because he does what he says. So he walks the talk. And what happened with Canada also shows that he answers to balance of power. And where I agree with you is that I firmly believe that we should retaliate. And there are different ways to retaliate without affecting European consumption. We've been talking about the tech giants a great deal. I do not think that we talk about the financial sector enough. In my opinion, we could be more impactful when working on the financial sector. I think that we should restrict the ability of American funds to raise savings. This is something that has been stated by the EU. We have other instruments that could be activated to drastically restrict the export of European savings towards the US. This doesn't affect European consumption. It would even be beneficial if it relocated part of our savings. And we also have European financials that are able to do more. And of course, there is X, Facebook, Microsoft. We do not have an immediate alternative. But I think we can do more. We do not focus on the financial sector enough. And finally, to make the link with tax issues, in the next few months, a new European loan is crucial for defense purposes, of course, but not only. There are also issues of innovation and green transition. Because we do not have an alternative to the next generation issue loan. So we need to launch a new large loan facility. And we cannot do that without our own resources. But if we take out a white loan, we cannot do it without our own resources. But there is also the carbon tax at the borders that should be reformed, but I will not enter in this debate right now. But the issue of taxation for multinational enterprises and the ultra-high net worth individuals should be also thought through as part of this debate of the launch of a new loan. So, but I agree with you when it comes to taking Trump seriously. Thank you very much for this debate. To add to what you said on Trump, if we say that we need a minimum taxation rate for the billionaires, why not go further and say there are billionaires in other countries and part of their wealth comes from the access that they have to the French market or the European markets? So most of their wealth comes from the companies they hold in France and within the EU. So logically speaking, and this is what was said as part of Pillar 2, there should be a minimum taxation rate on billionaires, but this rate should apply to foreign billionaires who are not taxed in their own countries. I agree with you. Trump could be an accelerating factor in this rationale, but if we say that we're ready to retaliate on tech giants and the financial system, why not go further and tax the largest American wealthy families? So, because they are oligarchs and they could bring in more funds. Yes, indeed, I agree. And I agree with you when you talked about taxing the financial system. In my opinion, it could be an accelerating factor of the debate. But let's bear one thing in mind. There are also European oligarchs who do business with Trump. CGM not too long ago, thanks to all the tax cuts, made proposals to Trump. This taxation cannot only be linked to their nationality, but rather to the location where they do business. There are Europeans that will benefit from the Trumpism trend. So, and I think we agree we shouldn't take coercive measures that would first affect European citizens, but let's take coercive measures towards those who can benefit from Trump's policies. So we're back to what we call financial leadership. And in the past few years, we've seen some oligarchs get richer and richer and benefiting from certain policies. This is the perfect segue with another idea. So to be brief, I think that we are in a situation where we experience different crises. And this is a systemic crisis that we're going through right now. When you look at history and you realize that at the end of the 19th century, we had a first crisis on this same issues of trade, and then it ended up in a world war later on. So I think that what we should suggest, as you said, is not only a moral leadership, but by interacting with other European countries and other international countries with the same issues. We shouldn't only look at coercive measures. We should suggest an alternative. We shouldn't go back to the perfect golden era before Trump. But we shouldn't go as far as Trump is going. So I think that the situation that we're in should help us move along those lines. The issue of solidarity protectionism isn't free trade, in my opinion, but requires bilateral agreements. But from an environmental point of view, this is quite positive. So I think this is quite positive, and we need to think this through, and then maybe find an alternative to the past system that we had in place and what Trump is offering. And so we should take this opportunity to redraw and rethink, overhaul coercive measures, put ourselves in the shoes of a new bloc, a bloc that will be competing with China and the US on the same weapons, because I think otherwise it might be terrible. And I partly agree with you. Oh, pretty good. That's pretty good. So on the balance of power, the main hurdle with the US and beyond Trump is a gap in terms of productivity and innovation, and this has been the case for 20 years. So our current national policies should move along those lines as well. And that is the reason I do not believe that a massive levy shock in France would help move along those lines. And I think that innovation investment would go backwards. And so will competitiveness if we are in this balance of power. Then, to react to what Gabriel said, I partly agree with what you said. I think that there are two different times for retaliation. First, we need to retaliate to the increase in tariffs. So this is a time for arm wrestling. We've mentioned the tech giants, the financial system, but the taxation issue should also be embedded in this debate. I haven't worked on this as much as you, but intuitively speaking, I think we're moving along the right lines. And then there's a second aspect to what you're saying. And then the second part of the retaliation should look at preparing for an alternative vision of globalization. Europe should not be only retaliating to what the US does and defending itself against globalization, or the globalization that we have now. And that is why Trump is so popular right now. But we should promote an alternative. I started this discussion by saying that one of our difficulties is that trade globalization creates winners and losers, and it's hard to redistribute from the winners to the losers. So I would conclude by saying we need to preserve our trade and environment, internationally speaking, although it should be regulated, especially in light of the environmental crisis. And this is the whole issue with the carbon tax at our borders. But from a general point of view, I think it's important to preserve trade, international trade, although they might fail, but we're not back to the 1930s. But Europe needs to suggest a macroeconomic and financial alternative. And I think this is the root cause of our issues nowadays. So we need to work on microeconomic issues. And I had talked about regulating Forex, for example. But if Europe is not investing enough and China is saving too much and the US is not consolidating enough, I think that having a European proposal will be absolutely necessary in the next 6 months.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you both. Thank you, everyone, for your attention. And it is time for the lunch break.